Hello, and welcome to this lecture for Unit 5 of the RSEAT training program. My name is James Milner, and I'm happy to share with you this short video as we explore meaningful refugee participation in a very particular context, in the context of participation within national delegations. In this short video, we want to go through a few questions to prepare you for participating in a meeting of the international refugee system. We'll explore what is a national delegation and why do delegations matter. We'll look a little bit at how delegations work, and then what are the various ways that refugees can participate within the work of delegations. But then critically, what are the steps to making this contribution, and what makes participation within national delegations meaningful? And that's the key, not to be tokenized when participating within a national delegation, but for that participation to be meaningful. So let's get started. What do we mean when we say a national delegation? A national delegation is like team representatives. It's delegations or groups of representatives from a United Nations member state that goes to a meeting and participates on behalf of that state. Now, states are very important in the working of the United Nations system. The UN Charter, signed in 1945, agrees to organize its work around the participation of UN member states. These states are sovereign. That means that they're the highest political authority that governs their territory. And the United Nations came together and said, these units called sovereign states are going to be the foundation upon which we build a multilateral, a collaborative, cooperative system. So there are currently 193 member states within the United Nations. And this is the collection, this is the political community that makes decisions within the United Nations. So this is why we think of the United Nations General Assembly as some kind of a global parliament. In the General Assembly, each of the 193 UN member states has a seat. And critically, each member state has a vote. So this is the connection between who these member states are and the way that multilateralism is supposed to work. The idea is that if we live in an international system that's based on the sovereign equality of states, these states come together in the United Nations system with the intention of cooperating, of solving their differences through peaceful means, and in finding collective solutions to shared problems. So this is the whole promise of the United Nations system as articulated within the General Assembly. But when these states come to a meeting of the General Assembly, when they come to a meeting of the international refugee system, it's not the whole country that participates. They have representatives. They delegate authority to a state delegation. Typically, a delegation will be in the area of, sometimes as small as 5, sometimes as large as 10, but it will be a group of people that are selected to represent different perspectives. Within a delegation, you may have political actors or bureaucratic actors. So you may have government ministers who are political authorities, or you may have public servants, bureaucrats, those functionaries of the state that are in place regardless of which government is in power of the day. You may have ambassadors, you may have counselors, you may have bureaucrats that come from the capital city. So one distinction within a composition is who are the political actors and who are the bureaucratic actors, but also who are the actors that come from the capital city. So who come from Ottawa, who come from Nairobi, who come from Bogota, versus who are the representatives that come from the permanent mission of that country in New York or in Geneva. So you'll have a mix of those who are political and who are bureaucratic, who are from the capital and who are from the local mission. And each of those actors will bring different perspectives in terms of the priorities that they're pursuing, but also the authority that they have and the relationships that they have. So representatives from the capital bring authority in terms of what the government will direct them to do. Likewise, political actors will be able to make decisions on behalf of the country. Bureaucratic actors are able to see those decisions through over time, and they advise political actors. And those who come from the missions within Geneva or New York, they have longer standing relationships with the other actors within the room. Increasingly, we also see that there are government actors and civil society actors. So government actors are those who are from within the government, either political or bureaucratic actors that represent that government. Civil society actors are non-state actors that are within the territory of that state. That might be non-governmental organizations. It might be faith groups. And increasingly, it's representatives of refugee-led initiatives. So, for example, when Canada sends a delegation to a meeting of the International Refugee System in Geneva, it will have both government representatives and civil society representatives. When we talk about Team Canada at a meeting in Geneva, for example, for UNHCR's Executive Committee, it will include representatives from the Government of Canada, from Global Affairs Canada, from Immigration and Refugees and Citizenship Canada. It will include representatives from the mission in Geneva, but it will also include a representative of the Canadian Council for Refugees, an umbrella organization representing refugee advocacy and service NGOs in Canada. It will include a representative from the Humanitarian Response Network, the umbrella organization representing international humanitarian NGOs based in Canada. And since 2020, it will also include a representative of the Refugee Advisory Network of Canada, who selects the refugee advisor to work within the delegation of the Government of Canada as it engages with the meeting. Now, who decides on the size of the delegation? I said earlier that there was quite a bit of variation. On the one hand, it's the United Nations that will say within this meeting, there's a limit on the size of the delegation that you can bring. So the size of the delegation is typically set by the organizer of the meeting. The composition of the delegation is at the discretion of the member state itself. So why are national delegations, why are these representatives of the UN member states so important? There are lots of different groups that participate in meetings. So civil society organizations, the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, different refugee-led networks are present. The UN itself, UNHCR, other UN agencies are there. But here's the critical distinction. When you look at the rules of how decisions are made within the international refugee system, civil society observes and states decide. It's very clear when you look at the rules of procedure, when you look at the rules that govern how these meetings are run, the actors that have the power to decide, that have the power to vote, it's states. Civil society can present evidence, can make statements, they can try and influence, but they don't get a vote. The only actors that vote every year on UNHCR's budget, the only actors that vote on conclusions of UNHCR's Executive Committee, the actors that have the binding decision of who is going to be the High Commissioner for Refugees, it's states. And that's by design. That's the whole principle around which the UN system is designed. And so it's very important when you see why participation within national delegations is such a particular kind of delegation. If refugee participation can influence the actions and the decisions of states within the international refugee system, they're able to influence the very concrete outcomes of states. And they can do this in two very different ways, either with the formal business of national delegations or the informal business. Refugee participation in the formal business of states is influencing what states say when they go to a meeting. What are the formal statements that they make? What are the positions that they take? And second, how do states vote? How do they vote about a budget? How do they vote in terms of a conclusion? Do they support an idea or do they oppose it? So with the formal agenda of a meeting, that's where states have formal power. But there's also quite a bit of informal business that happens in meetings. At a meeting of the International Refugee System, it's not just the formal business of what happens within the meeting room, but it's what happens on the margins, where there are official meetings between a delegation and UNHCR, for example, and where there are meetings on the margins of informal groupings, state coalitions that form around particular meetings, and also those very informal meetings that happen on the margins. Delegations are involved in a lot of work when they go to a meeting in Geneva, not just on the formal agenda, but those informal meetings on the margins are often more influential or more substantive. That's where the agenda is set and where often binding decisions are put into motion within these informal meetings. And that's the work of delegations within these meetings. It's very specific, is very political, and is binding. So that's why the work of delegations and participation within those delegations is so important. Arguably, the greatest site of influence for refugee participation within the governance of the global refugee regime is the ability to support refugee participation within national delegations. And this is important because when we think about where decisions are actually made, there's an article by Marian Friese on building consensus within UNHCR's executive committee. And she talks about how the crafting of a very particular executive committee conclusion on protection of children at risk, the work of crafting that decision, that instrument, long predated the meeting where it was brought to a formal vote. And so this is even more important when you think about where decisions are made and how decisions can be influenced. That it's not, when we think about examples of global refugee policy, that the decision-making process, that moment of voting, is the last of a series of steps that result in the policies that have this binding influence on the functioning of the regime as a whole. And states play a critical role in deciding what issues will be on the agenda. They play a critical role in formulating what the policy will look like, and they play an official role in making that decision at the end. Now, so the ability to influence the way states work within the regime through delegations and the ongoing work of states within the regime is critical, that it's on an ongoing way before the meeting itself, in setting the agenda, in deciding on the options, and then being there to influence the final decision. Because there's a formal decision-making moment when all states that are members of UNHCR's executive committee, when they cast a vote. But the informal decision-making happens before the meeting. What issues get onto the agenda? What options are there? So it's really important to think about the work of the governing of the refugee regime as being both these formal moments and these informal processes. In theory, every member state gets a vote, but in practice, some states are more active in setting the agenda and proposing these options, and they have disproportionate influence on the direction of the regime. And so delegations work in a very particular way at three very distinct stages: before a meeting, during a meeting, and after a meeting. There's quite a bit of work that happens before a meeting of the International Refugee System, in forming a delegation and deciding which individuals are going to represent different different dimensions or different parts of a delegation. So who's going to represent which government ministries at what level? Who's going to represent these civil society groups? There's quite a bit of work that happens in both reviewing the agenda and often in trying to set the agenda. So in looking at what is the agenda for the meeting, there'll be a very conscious process of saying, what will be the priorities that we set? What do we want to get out of this meeting as a national delegation? And so that will be a very a very particular process that involves different members of a delegation proposing different priorities and articulating what those priorities might be and how they might be pursued. There's also a very active process in drafting the formal statements that the delegation will make. So at UNHCR's executive committee, for example, there's a general statement, a statement on protection issues, and a statement on management issues. And each of those statements are crafted, are approved at the political level, and different actors can influence what those statements are going to say. That's the formal position that governments take through their delegations at meetings of the International Refugee System. So this work happens often weeks before the actual meeting takes place. So for refugee participation to be able to influence the work of a delegation, it needs to start and be engaged with all of this preparatory work that happens long before the meeting. During the meeting itself, there is, as I mentioned, both the formal and the informal business. There's the question of how the delegation engages with the formal agenda in the formal meeting room in the hall. And then there's the informal business about who is the delegation going to try and meet with to have a meeting on the margins or an informal conversation. With whom do they want to make démarches? You often see delegations meeting for breakfast on the days of the meeting saying, how are we going to engage with the agenda today? Who's going to be in the assembly hall? Who's going to be meeting with others on the margins? Who's going to this reception? Who's going to this side event? And what are the priorities that we want to try and pursue? It's a very active and dynamic process during the meeting itself, where issues come up and connections are made and priorities are pursued in real time through the meeting. But that's not where the work ends. The work of a delegation then continues after the meeting, where members of the delegation then brief their respective groups on what happened, and where there is then a collective debriefing by the delegation on what did we see, what did we achieve, and now how do we move forward on the basis of what we achieved within that meeting. So delegations work before, during, and after the meeting. And it's important to have that timeline in mind, because for refugee participation to be meaningful, it needs to be engaged with each of these stages, each of these processes before, during, and after the meeting. And there are very particular kinds of roles that refugees can play within national delegations at each of these stages. Before a meeting, a refugee representative or a refugee advisor within a delegation can make sure that they're consulting with other refugee groups within their country on what are the issues and the priorities and the perspectives that they have. How can you share these priorities to the other members of the delegation and influence the setting of priorities? It's very important as a refugee advisor to a delegation to not act as an individual, but to act in a way that tries to bring the very diverse perspectives of other refugee-led organizations, different refugee-led initiatives within your country, to bring those priorities into the work of the delegation to try and influence the priorities that the delegation set. You are there as part of the development of a team strategy, and you are an equal member of that team. So to be able to bring that evidence, to be able to bring that advocacy, but to be able to bring that expertise into the meeting is critical. During the meeting itself, it's very critical to be actively involved in both providing input and facilitating connections. That as a member of your national delegation, you're bound by the confidentiality of your delegation in the way that you engage with these priority setting exercises to provide input, to play those roles that you can play in advancing refugee priorities within the work of your delegation. But also within the bounds of the confidentiality agreements, the participation agreements that you'll likely sign with your government, that you also have scope to be able to consult back with other refugee-led organizations, other refugee-led initiatives, other refugee representatives in your country in real time as issues come up, to gather information, to gather evidence, to help make the case, but also to get that input so that you can be a representative of these diverse perspectives in the work of your delegation. Always make sure that you check with your head of delegation what you can share and what you need to keep confidential, but certainly in terms of the issues that you're going to be discussing, what's the evidence that you can bring to help inform and guide the work of your delegation. And then after the meeting, write up your reflections and share that with the head of delegation and other members of the delegation. What was your experience like? What were moments where you felt you were able to make a contribution? What were the limits on your ability to contribute? But then also to take that time to make sure that you share with other refugee-led organizations, other refugee-led initiatives, other refugee leaders within your national context, what was achieved at that meeting? What were the decisions that were made that now need to be implemented, and that where state actors and UNHCR can be held accountable? And this is the challenge of participation, as we have discussed in earlier units, to make sure that refugee participation is not tokenistic. Refugee participation within delegations must be substantial. It's not just based on your opinion, but it's based on the evidence that you can bring. It's engaged in the substantial work of the delegation as itself, and it's sustained over time. It's a lot of work to be involved before the meeting, during the meeting, long hours, often 14, 15-hour days during the meeting itself. And then after the meeting as well, to do that debriefing, that disseminating, and that reflection. Your participation needs to be informed. You need to be bringing evidence from the research community and connect with researchers within your country to get that evidence. It needs to be informed by the experience of refugee-led organizations and initiatives within your country. It's not just your opinion. It's the evidence that you can bring. It's the expertise that you bring that's going to make your participation much more meaningful. It needs to be representative. You need to do your best, not just to represent the priorities of your community, but of all refugee communities. So to try and reach out and understand the diversity of perspectives, the diversity of refugee perspectives within your country. And while you are just one refugee and you cannot claim to understand the lived realities in different contexts around your country in terms of different nationalities, genders, locations, what have you, you can do your best to represent these diversity of perspectives through the evidence that you bring and the perspectives and the consultations that you have in the lead up to the meetings. And you also need to be accountable. That for your participation to be meaningful and for your participation to be seen as legitimate, you need to hold yourself accountable and be held accountable by other refugee leaders within your country, that you are doing your best to represent these diverse perspectives and not just your own interests. And this is why, to make refugee participation in delegations meaningful, it's important to facilitate the development of inclusive refugee leadership ecosystems within countries, to forge these partnerships and have mechanisms to consult, to decide collectively, to bring these diverse perspectives into conversation with the opportunity for refugee participation to transform the way member states behave in the governance of the refugee regime. And that's the goal of this training, is to equip you with the tools that you need so that when you are able to participate in a context as political as the national delegation, that you're equipped with the understanding and the tools to make the most of that opportunity. In this lecture, we talked about what is a national delegation and why delegations matter, how delegations work and the different moments at which they work and the context within which they work. We talked about how refugees can contribute to a delegation and what are the steps to making this contribution. Being a refugee advisor in a national delegation is a massive responsibility. It has the potential to transform the way the refugee system is governed. But it's the responsibility of those individual refugees who have that opportunity to make sure that it's meaningful before, during, and after a meeting, that it's substantial, that it's sustained, that it's informed, and that it represents diverse perspectives. If this can happen, and if more national delegations can be convinced to include refugee advisors within their delegations, the governance of the refugee regime will be transformed, and it may be more likely that it can deliver on its commitment of ensuring protection and solutions for refugees. I hope this lecture was helpful in your preparation and your journey. Wherever you are, I hope you're safe and well. Take good care. Bye-bye.